Morning, folks. It's great to be here, and thanks for coming out. Nice to see so many familiar faces also. So my position is that the prison system in America is a failure. Not just a small failure, a huge, catastrophic failure. To start off with a few statistics, we've got 2.3 million people in prisons in the US today. That's more than fivefold the figure that existed in prisons in 1980. To give you a framework, the era of mass incarceration in this country began around 1980. So some of us in this audience have only lived in an America that has had this addiction to imprisoning people. That's 1 in every 100 adults. And then within that, the prison system tends to punish and impact people who are poor. And in America, where poverty and class and race are so intertwined, the prison system batters minorities and poor communities and communities of colour. There's a lot of problems, and we're going to go through them today, prompted by the slides. But if we're under any doubt that inequality exists or doesn't exist in this country, let me give you a stat. If you are a black male born today, if trends continue, you have a 1 in 4 chance of being incarcerated in your lifetime. For white males, it's something like 1 in 17, 1 in 18. So, on that happy note, let's get started. I always throw these quotes up. They're variations of each other. They're often misattributed to one another. And you'll see these on the taglines of emails from prison reformers around. So why am I here? We're all interested in design, image, advertising, communications, and persuading people, right? Now, I want to persuade people to care about this issue that's largely invisible. If it's largely invisible, what do we see of it? So that's my starting point. I want to encourage folk to be reasonable and conscientious consumers of images. I also want to test the idea that photography can have an impact, but also want to put a lot of photography into a context also. I'll look at how photography is distributed, consumed, and manufactured, and try and figure out where the political and social motives are that lie behind that photography. I don't know how comfortable we all are with talking about this issue, but I want to reassure you it's okay to... I'm not trying to embarrass anyone, and also I recognize that prisons are either ignored or fetishized. This is a picture from 1928. It's a photograph of Ruth Schneider. She was the first woman to be executed for a capital offense. She was sentenced for murdering her husband. And of course, you're not allowed cameras into execution chambers. So what the New York Daily News did was they sent this guy called Tom Howard from Chicago to New York because they knew that the New York authorities wouldn't recognize this guy. And as they flicked the switch, he lifted his trouser leg, and on his ankle he had attached a camera, and he got this one shot off. It was cropped, and then this was on the front pages of newspapers across the world the next day. So this very sort of like, I wouldn't say twisted, but understandable interest in prisons exists, but I argue that in the mainstream media it's fetishized and prisoners are largely cast as the other. I want to convince people that prisoners are us and the prisons are ours. Prisons are part of our society, and so it's incumbent on us to care about how they function and to analyze and keep check if they're doing things well. There's lots of graphs I could show you. I'll start with this one, just to give you an idea of the vast, rapid increase. This is American exceptionalism at its best, okay? No other Western nation, developed nation, incarcerates people like America. America puts people away at 6 times the rate of the next industrialized country, and I'll put my hand up, that's the UK. So it's about 715 every 100,000 people. In the UK, it's 115 every 100,000, and all European nations are below that level. This is a man-made situation. It feasibly can be man-unmade. We've got a long way to go. Within that 5-fold increase of the prison system in America, there's been an 8-fold increase of women incarcerated in America since 1980. Women haven't become any more violent or dangerous. The acts that women have done and been prosecuted for under the war on drugs legislations have just put them into prison and into jails. Largely conspiracy charges. They happen to be in a place with someone who is, usually a man who's committing a crime. I've gone through these stats. I'm not going to read off a board for you, but these are the touchstones, really. It's really reminders that there's something going on in America right now that's never been done in the history of man. Imprisonment in America is a huge social experiment, and I argue that it's failed. We tend to have causes of the day that come up. Right now, there seems to be a lot of talk about solitary confinement. That's great. Psychological torture needs to be done away with. But these are some other things that we could be looking at. All right, so what do we know of prisons? This is a Google search for the word prison, and we have clip art, we have bars, we have cliches, we have hands, receding cell tiers. Remember this one at the bottom, second from right, that's California, that's going to crop up later. But really, we're not learning anything about the people inside. When we search prisoner, we get this, it gets worse. All right, so I think, we've got some Second World War photos. This is from Tool Slang. We've got a Hugh Jackman poster right in the middle. But really, this is offensive to me. And I think we deal with prisons with humor as a coping strategy. I mean, let's be real here. We have a culture that routinely laughs about prison rape. Okay, so I'm going to set this talk up in 2 parts. The first part is depiction, the second part is connection. I'm going to give us a quick run through of the history of photography in American prisons. And then I'm going to talk in the second part about projects that maybe do more than depict, maybe get us closer to prisoners, maybe engage with the prisoner class in a way that can inform us and benefit society as a whole, but also benefit the prisoners. So away we go. I'm going to be talking very quickly. I will say at this point, if you've got any questions, throw your hands up. I'm going to bombard you with information. And I just hope we can all enjoy the ride. Okay, so we're going to start in the 70s. How many of you are old enough to remember Vietnam War? Okay, do you remember when politicians were telling you one thing and the photographers were showing you others? Okay. Age of the Civil Rights era and Stonewall, 1968. There's a real sense of change in America. And Danny Lyon and other photographers went to the South and went into the prisons there and realized that the prisons operated on the same control that the Jim Crow era had done also. And so a lot of the earliest prison photography comes out of a documentary tradition that wants to tie prisons to narratives of social inequality and social injustice. Prior to the 60s, most prison photography was like mugshot fetishism, mafia, mugshots, some street photography, Ouija, but it wasn't, prisoners weren't considered victims of a system. They were considered, bad guys. This is Danny Line also. This is Huntsville in Texas. Danny Line did a really good job of photographing how bodies were ordered in space and the racial ordering of bodies also. And I just look at the smirks on these three guards' faces, and that kind of says it all to me. He was very blatant. He was evoking the time of slavery. In Louisiana, in Texas, in some of the southern states, people still work on farms. In Arizona, there's a crackpot sheriff who has chain gangs that go out and pick up litter from the street and paint curbstones. As well as being abuse, it's actually a clever visual ploy. He owns the stripes. And Gary Winogrand, very famous street photographer, even he got to Huntsville and to Texas. Eve Arnold died recently. She lived to a ripe old age. She must have been close to 60 years of age when she made this series. She was from the New York set. She was with Magnum Photographs. And when she went down there, she was absolutely shocked what she saw. She really did experience the South as a different country. And she returned over several years to make this body of work, Sugarland. Again, it's like we're looking at something from 1880 instead of 1980. Bringing us closer up to date, Maury Kami. He lived in Petaluma, which is known for its chicken sheds and chicken farming. Very early on, he saw that something was changing in his home state of California, and he was a stone's throw from San Quentin. And this body of work, you can pick this book up for like $2 or $3 on Amazon. I encourage you all to get it. It's one of the finest examples of respectful portraiture in prisons we'll find. He also included statements by each of his subjects, which was also unheard of, ahead of his time. And usually when you look at prison photographs, you see men with their shirts off, flexing, showing off the tattoos. I guess Maury just spent enough time there that he managed to get past that initial presentation. And there's over 100 subjects, and the variation is rather incredible. Maury was a real sympathizer. Douglas Kent Hall, on the other hand, was scared shitless. He passed a few years ago. I spoke to his widow, and he wasn't a prison reformer. He was more interested in photographing marginalized communities in his home state of New Mexico. So he went to Santa Fe Penitentiary, which at the time was the only men's prison in the state. But he said it was absolutely terrifying. And I think it's because he did encounter these hardened incorrigibles. I'm very wary using that term, but I want to explain that now we have drug addicts, people who are mentally ill, people who've got caught up in transgressive acts due to disadvantage and misfortune. Our prisons aren't full of dangerous predators, whatever our politicians would like to tell us. And this is right at that cusp when things start to change and the prison industry started ramping up in the early 80s. Taro Yamasaki, he won a Pulitzer for this series. In Michigan, they were very worried after Attica that the tensions were growing in the Michigan state prison system. And so they were desperately trying to find solutions, but they didn't have the money or the resources to expand. Over Christmas in 1980 and New Year 1981, Taro Yamasaki went into South Michigan State Prison, also known as Jackson Prison. He was there for a week, and he realized on day 2 that if he was going to take any good pictures, he needed to shake his prison guard chaperone. And he did. You got pictures of drugs. You got pictures of knives. He was advised not to go into cells unaccompanied, but he did. And what he ended up managing to do was actually portray the violence and the tension and the gang control within that prison in a way that just wasn't possible if he'd maintained his chaperone with his guard. Incidentally, Yamasaki's father was the architect for the Twin Towers. Again, how's everyone doing, by the way? How's the pace? Coming up to more recent times, Ken Light went to Texas. He only got access because he had a friend, Susan Donovan, who was with the ACLU. And she'd gone to Texas briefly, wanted to leave and return to California, but she knew she had to do something significant before she did. So she called Ken. She said, let's do a book on death row. I'll write it, you photograph it. Ken said, absolutely, why not? Sure. Not expecting that they would get access. Susan Donovan had contacts. It was a case of like who you know, not what you know. And they got in. And so Ken visited 3 times over a year. He made about 4,000 images, and he chose 89 for the book. But I throw this one up because we need to think not only what we see, but also of what we don't see. This is Cameron Todd Willingham. He was the feature of a New Yorker article a few years back now, which revisited his case. He was executed. He was charged with murdering his 3 children, charged with setting his house on fire deliberately. And they revisited the case with new forensics, fire forensics, arson forensics, and figured out that it was an electrical fire. Beyond any reasonable doubt, this guy did not set fire to his house. Now, this guy wasn't Father of the Year, but he wasn't guilty of the crime for which he was put to death. Depending on where your politics are, you're going to say, you know, America has executed innocent men. This is a case that we can look to as a touchstone and say, in this case, America put to death an innocent man. When the New Yorker story broke, there was only one place all the news was going to, and that was to Ken and his archive. James Nachtwey, maybe one of the photographers that gets outside the photography community and whose name is known. He's basically won everything there is, 5 Robert Capa gold medals, the most decorated war photographer of recent years. Spends his time going from conflict area to conflict area. I find it very interesting that when he wanted to find severe trauma in America, he went to the Alabama prison system. And he's working in the same tradition as Danny Lyon and Bruce Jackson, evoking slavery and the body politic. Lori Wazelchuk, she's my favorite. She lives in Philadelphia now. Grace Before Dying became a book. And she worked quite collaboratively. When she exhibited the work, she also toured quilts that the men had made, and those were sold alongside of prints, and the money all went to the Prison Hospice. Yes?
Why does it say ghost?
That was his nickname. I think can you see the GH on his other sock? So resources are so slim, pillowcases and clothing is all written with their names, with their nicknames. And on the topic of resources, if you speak to Bill Kane, who's the very charismatic warden at Angola, he'll take the credit for the prison hospice. Now, sure, he has to sign off on it, right? But the hospice actually exists because of the committed efforts of 2 medical professionals, volunteers who came in from outside and trained the prisoners to take care of their fellow prisoners, and they delivered dignity in death. Oprah did a documentary about this place. It's a lovely story, right? But the background to that story is that we have an aging prison population And the cost for medical care, if you go past 55, 65, goes from 50 to 100 to 150 grand a year, depending on what state you're in. Oh, bollocks.
Most of the people serving time in that prison are going to die in that prison.
Right. Thank you. I'd lost my train of thought. Angola Prison is a very strange place. There's 5,500 prisoners, and about 5,300 of those will die in prison, because in Louisiana there's very harsh sentencing, and most of them, 95% of them, are on life without parole sentences. It's an incredible place for all the wrong reasons. Louisiana has some of the harshest penalties around for prisoners. Andrew Lichtenstein, this body of work is dormant right now. It was very difficult for him to do this. After 8 years, he got out, but now he wants to revisit and publish the work. It'll be a great thing for all of us when it does come out. And Jen Ackerman's Trapped. I spoke on Think Out Loud this week, and the guests before me were talking about mental illness in the wake of Robin Williams' death. And the psychiatrist in the green room mentioned to me that prisons, must be housed full of people with mental illness, particularly psychotic disorders. And I had to agree with him, because the warden of this prison basically said that his prison had become the default mental health institution in the state of Kentucky, to the point that this was the best mental health care available. I think it's a desperate case here, but the estimates are somewhere between 50 and 60% of prisoners have diagnosed medical health issues. Sometimes a prison is not the best environment for care and treatment for that. Sometimes you don't have to be a photographer to make a difference or make a statement. This body of work is absolutely beautiful. Cheryl Hannah Truscott is a midwife and a nurse physician based up in Washington State. And this is shot at the Washington Corrections Center for Women, also known as Purdy, outside of Gig Harbor. And I include this work because these types of programs are the rarity. There's probably about half a dozen programs. There's a really good mothers and babies program in Ohio. There is one at a minimum security jail in Pomona, California, where women can be with their children until they're 7 years of age inside the jail during the day. Most states, if a woman gives birth in prison, they have 24 to 48 hours with the baby until it's taken away by the state, preferably put into care of another family member, if not into foster care. Here, they get to stay with the babies for 2 years. Other programs, it's 3. And the reason I bring this up is in light of that fact that so many more women are being locked up, it becomes an issue. In California last year, there was about 230 women who gave birth within prison. And when the scientific research says that for the psychological health and growth of a child, that attachment with its mother in the very early days is one of the key components. Can we have a prison system that is flexible enough to accommodate that? I don't know. I also want to make clear, despite how good this program is, I'm not arguing here for better prisons. I'm arguing generally for fewer prisons. R. O'Shagan, he started off in the Los Angeles juvenile detention system, which is the largest juvenile detention system in the world. And then he followed 6 youngsters as they went into the adult prison system in California. And he said he saw these kids bulk up physically and wither psychologically. He's clever because within the body of work, again, he includes statements from the children. There's that closeness, that intimacy, and the title, A Poor Imitation of Death, comes from the line of a poem by one of his young collaborators. It's beautiful, isn't it? This is Stephen Torrentes. He sells his prints for thousands. I asked him if that was a problem, and he said that maybe the people with money who might not necessarily have this issue come onto their radar could do well to see it in the galleries and maybe on the walls of their home. He also said you don't have to use an activist language to make an activist point of view. So far, the series, which is called Of Lengths and Measures, includes probably about 80 images. And he noticed when he was driving back to his parents' house down in the 80s and 90s, and they lived in, I think, Iowa, somewhere in the Midwest, there was these glows emerging on the horizon that weren't there previously, not there when he was a kid. So he's thinking this is like a new off-ramp for an interstate, or it's a new town with a gas station, or maybe it's sort of like grain silos. When he got close, he realized it's a prison. And that's what prisons have done as they've grown, and there are now 5,300 locked facilities in the US. As they've grown, they've been situated in high desert and in mountains and in remote spots, visibly hidden, strategically hidden, and also exist to prop up depressed post-industrial American towns. And so, but they never turn the lights off. And that's the conceit in his work. And he calls this glow, this spectre, the feedback of exile. Deborah Luster, also just phenomenal, beautiful person, beautiful work. If there's anyone in the country who has a reason to hate prisoners and be fearful, it's Deborah. Her mother was killed by a contract killer in the 90s in Arizona. And she's from Arkansas, and I think at the time she was living in Louisiana. And she picked up a camera to sort of like cope and occupy herself, but she never had an intention of photographing prisoners. And she was in North Louisiana on an assignment to shoot some farm company report. And she drove past a prison. And literally she stopped and went up and knocked on the gate. And she spoke to the warden, and he said, come back on Monday. And that started a 5-year project for her. So she worked frantically. She clearly enjoyed the company. She said the stories that came out of those 3 Louisiana prisons, San Gabriel, Angola, and one other, were the best stories she's ever heard. But she worked frantically because it was all she could do to mirror the size of the system she encountered. So she made 15,000 prints and 25,000 images. And what she found is those prints that she gave away started to be used as emotional currency. She met one lady and she said, thank you, because I sent that photograph to my child who I'd not seen. She had 6 children, and 2 or 3 of them showed up a month later with a visit, and she'd not seen them in years. Okay, any questions so far? Are we feeling hopeful? Maybe here I can give us some answers of what we can do and how we can empower ourselves. So, I've recently been thinking about photographers' entry into prisons and wondering how that shapes itself. There's an argument to be said, if a prison invites a photographer inside, then the photographer is only going to see what the prison wants the photographer to see. So does the photographer then become, by some definition, an extension of the prison's power? I don't know the answer to that. I'm not hard on it. But it has encouraged me to look elsewhere at different types of imagery. So we want to look at prisoners as collaborators. We want to look at photography workshops, prison visiting room portraiture, surveillance, and evidence imagery. This is a photograph by Richard Ross. He has visited I'm going to say 300 facilities over a period of 5 years. And he did so with the help of a sabbatical and a large grant from the Guggenheim. And now he gives his images away for free. He has confessed to me that he has charity fatigue in some cases, but if you contact him earnestly and with purpose, he'll let you use his images for free. Because juvenile detention in this country is a huge, huge issue. On any given day, there's about 65,000 kids locked up. And this is the photograph that everyone remembers. This is a young kid, I think he's a 12-year-old, in Biloxi, Mississippi. Juvenile injustice, remember it might just help you out. Prison arts is not an unusual thing. Okay, we can use the pencil, we can use the paintbrush, we can do painting, we can do creative writing. I'm wondering if we can use the camera as an arts tool. Unfortunately, to prison administrations, the camera is in their hands a security measure, and in the hands of anyone else a security hazard. But there are some examples we can look to where photography has been used for prisoners to view their world and tell their stories. Klavdic Sluban is a Slovenian based in Paris, and he has worked in Guatemala, Ireland, Portugal, Moldova, always with juveniles. He said the youth prisons in Ireland were the toughest he encountered. But he also says once you get in there, the power of the work is quite outstanding. He's proved that it can be done. Cosmin Bumba did a 6-week course in a Romanian women's prison, created 14,000 images. Vance Jacobs in Colombia noticed that we're everywhere except America. At the same time as exhibiting them in the prison, he also exhibited them at the Cultural Institution in Medellin. Michael Subotsky in South Africa. I'll pause there because this is quite a powerful image. This is a photograph of a prisoner taking the opportunity to wash in the laundry machine, either because showers weren't available to him or showers were unsafe. Now, Michael Subotsky is the young superstar of photography. This series, Die Vier Hoeken, which means the four corners, put him on the map. He got inside the South African prisons, and what he found was that they reflected not apartheid era, but even post-apartheid era racial inequality. What he didn't say, though, and I don't know why, I can only presume he's a very modest man, is that while he was in there, he did a photography workshop. This is interesting because male and female prisoners are together. I'm also not entirely comfortable with that arm. I don't know whether it's fondness or it's menace. But he's not shared these images. And this was an image made by one of his students. And I think that if he had, then we might have got an extended view of South African prisons. Steve Davis, a good friend of mine, he's the coordinator of photography at Evergreen State College. This is the IMU at Green Hill, the Intense Management Unit. This is the severest lockdown for kids that exists in the state of Washington. And Steve went into this wing with his assistant, and he had his back to this scene, and he was just getting his gear ready, and his assistant tapped him on the shoulder. He said, "Turn around." And those guys were all stood at their window looking out. Now, these guys can't see each other, but I guess when there's a noise or some activity outside of your cell and you're locked down for 23 hours a day, then it's probably going to hold your attention. Steve got out his camera. 5 minutes later, they were still there. Very powerful shot. Steve also did some prison photography workshops. Where we do find prison photography workshops in America, we find them in youth facilities. So this is pinhole camera, long exposure, possibly a double exposure. You'll see at the back, they are mimicking the restraint and control postures that they are required to adopt as routine in the prison. Origami in the foreground. Steve worked in 4 facilities over a period of 5 years. And unusually, the kids were allowed to keep the cameras between his weekly classes. He set them themes and they would take photographs throughout the week. It was quite successful, but he did find that some of the prison officers confiscated the cameras as a disciplining measure. It was always a tense relationship, a negotiation, but successful, I would say. And what you see is kids being kids, right? Also exhibiting terrible fashions. But the fact that this kid wants to pose with this photograph says something to me, and I'll come back to that point later. Also, they took the opportunity to set up shots. This requires a level of cooperation. Don't worry, this isn't as bad as it looks. It's wonderful performance, really. Working with the camera in a performative way. The cue for this was vulnerability. That was the theme for the week. And so within the collection of photographs, of which there's 200 or 300, there's many where they are adopting fetal positions and scared. Okay, so if we think that, and I'm not convinced that a photograph is good for prisoners. On the list of needs, you know, a camera might be pretty low. But I want to argue that photography plays a role in people telling their own story, putting out their own narrative, okay? In the era of mass incarceration, photography was just banned, especially from male institutions. And right now, I don't know of any prison photography workshop in a male adult prison in this country. But it doesn't mean they didn't exist. The Floating Foundation of Photography in New York throughout the 70s and across 8 prisons delivered photography workshops. And they had a whole host of like big name photographers, Lisette Modell, Gene Smith, Mary Allen Mark, Arthur Tress. This is an Arthur Tress picture. And what they would do is they would go into the prisons, they'd do the workshops, and then they would go back to Manhattan and exhibit these photographs in Central Park, in public spaces, and sell them to fund the continuation of the program. In the 1980s, a young lady called Karen Ruckman went into the Lawton jail, which is in Virginia, but it was the jail for Washington, D.C. It doesn't exist now, and if you are convicted in Washington, D.C., you're sent into the federal system, which basically means you could be sent anywhere in the country. Karen is making a film. It's going to be released next year. The trailer is online. I also have an interview with her on my website. I encourage you to check it out. At the time, Karen had no idea how pioneering she was being, nor could she imagine that this was the last time a prison photography workshop would exist within an American prison. Right now, there's 2 projects, one in New Mexico and one in Rhode Island for the youth who are using cameras for empowerment and telling their own narratives. AS220 is the most established with more staff and I would say sort of like more quality output. The thing about AS220 is also they have studio space, they have a music studio, they have a restaurant, a bar, a printing workshop right downtown in Providence. And when the kids come out of the Rhode Island Training School, which is where they do the projects, they're taken under their wing and ushered back into society and back into all these other programs. It takes a hell of a lot of work and a hell of a lot of energy. Re-entry for most prisoners, especially male adults, is not so nurturing, let's say. This is Deborah Lee Wallage. She was a huge part of the San Francisco trans community. She also suffered with addiction, and she was in and out of prison for the best part of 20 years. Robert has spent almost a decade now going into the jails in San Francisco and meeting prisoners. He doesn't call himself a journalist, he doesn't call himself an activist. You might get him to say he's interested in story and he's a story facilitator. He doesn't even have set questions. The deal is, he goes in, he says, I'll make your portrait, I'll give you 4 copies, we'll put some on a CD, that goes in your property, you can have it when you get out. In return, tell me a story. That's it. It's a project that can only exist because he can self-publish on it online. So if you go to takeapicturetellthestory.com, you'll find this huge archive. And so Bob tries to get out of the way as much as he can and allow the prisoners just to speak for themselves. And there's no agenda. And it's raw, and I think, to my mind, it's one of the best projects out there. I think Tamika is expecting a 5th child here. The key thing about Bob is that he only pairs portraits with audio. If he didn't have the audio, the piece wouldn't exist. And I don't think it's unusual for visual artists to insist now on a multimedia approach. Okay, Elise Ender. I spoke about Elise's work when I was asked to pick out one body of work this week on the radio. There's so many layers. Okay, so in prisons, in visiting rooms, after the mugshot is made of the prisoner, the next opportunity they have to present themselves to the camera, and the only opportunity they have, unless people like Beth go in with a camera as a journalist, is to pose for a camera operated either by a staff member or by a prisoner volunteer in the visiting room. Also in America, from no central point or planning have emerged these brightly colored painted murals. The history is unclear. There was mural painting back in the 30s and 40s, but these smaller murals in prison visiting rooms have almost meme-like, have come into existence all over the country. And so if you speak to Elise, she doesn't say that it's a generous gesture from the prison to, find a nice spot to have your photograph taken. She says it's a control measure because that's the space for photography, and if the camera's pointing that way, it's not pointing that way at the mirror, door, lock, or staff member. They're also interesting because they describe absolutely nowhere. You get beaches, you get mountains, you get waterfalls. Sometimes you get city skylines of the main city, New York, Chicago. Elise, as well as collecting over a period of 6 years, more than 200 of these photographs that she solicited through correspondence with hundreds of men and women. She then visited prisons and she drew the camera back because she was like, we need to know, we need to see outside of this frame. And what she found was now those painted murals are being replaced by printed vinyl. In some cases, they have carousels mounted to the ceiling, and you press your button and you choose your one of 8 scenes that you want. I mean, they're so freakish. They've got cartoon characters. They've got sort of like Camelot-themed ones. My point is, with 2.3 million people in prison and 13 million people being cycled through prisons and jails each year, conservatively, we could estimate there's tens of millions of these types of photographs. These are an absolute central part of the American vernacular photography tradition. If we're going to look at what photography is and how it's used, we have to include this type of imagery. Elise's book is called Prison Landscapes, and it's just phenomenal. It's eye-opening. And so for this to only emerge in recent years, largely because of Elise's efforts, kind of is indicative of how much we've been missing for so long. These are the photographs that belong to the loved ones that exist in the wallets and on the mantles. But I think they can also inform us a hell of a lot more of what's going on in prisons. Let me see what else I've got here. Oh, I've got so much. But I'm actually going to stop on this slide. I showed this photograph to a young girl at the Rhode Island Training School, which is the spot where they were doing the youngsters photography workshop. And I asked her, is this a good photograph or a bad photograph? And she said it's a bad photograph. And I was like, well, of course it's a bad photograph. Like, it's straight on, it's poorly lit, it's a crappy digital print. But I was generous. I said, explain to me why it's a bad photograph. And she said, because she is smiling. And she explained that if she's in prison, she can't be happy. Therefore, the smile must be fake. And that's another thing about these images, they're performative. If you've had a crappy morning, if you've had a run-in with an officer, or if someone has nicked your breakfast, if you're having an episode, if your only opportunity comes once every month or 2 or 3 to stand in front of that camera to have an image made that then goes to your grandma, you're going to do your best to perform. And yeah, we'll leave it there. I've got lots more I could say, but I will just say thank you very much for your time.